So I'm turning it over to Saru Jayaraman from One Fair Wage to talk to us about economic justice during COVID today.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me and see me okay. Very excited to be with you today, and thank you to Women's March for pulling this together, as always, and uplifting all different kinds of issues, including what we're going to talk about today, which is economic justice and the issues facing low-wage workers during the pandemic and going forward. So it's a very emotional time for all of us. It's been a kind of a huge roller coaster for all of us. I know over the last year, over the last couple of weeks, 2021 seems to be no less crazy than 2020. It's a particularly emotional time for me, the workers I represent, the organizations I represent, because last Thursday, when Biden announced President Biden announced his $1.9 trillion COVID stimulus plan, it included this most groundbreaking piece that I think most people didn't see, which is not only a $15 minimum wage, but also full elimination of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, for workers with disabilities, and for youth. And so we might actually see in a matter of weeks ending of multiple legacies of slavery that I will explain in a minute that have been the source of suffering for literally tens of millions of women over 150 years. So a little bit first back. So I'm going to tell you all about that. It's pretty incredible. But I want to tell you first about me and the movement that we've led over the last 20 years to get to this point, this incredible point. So my kind of career began with 9/11. On September 11th, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center in New York City, Tower 1. On that morning, about 73 workers died and about 13,000 workers lost their jobs in the restaurant industry. And for those of you that were adults during 9/11, because I don't assume that of everybody here, but it's incredible to think about the fact that this will be the 20th anniversary. This September will be the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So it was a moment in history like this last year that marked us. And in many ways, what we experienced in New York City in the aftermath of 9/11 was eerily reminiscent of the pandemic. People had died, restaurants were closed, businesses were closed, workers had lost their jobs. And out of the ashes of that tragedy, though, hopefully we'll see the same happening here. Out of the ashes of that tragedy, I was asked to start a relief center together with workers from Windows on the World, which was the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center that grew into a national movement to fight for restaurant workers. And after many years of both organizing these workers and understanding their needs, because I've been an academic all along, so we were conducting surveys, participatory research with these workers. What we heard from workers over and over and over again in the restaurant industry was that wages were their top concern. And what we learned is that the restaurant industry prior to the pandemic was the absolute largest and fastest growing private sector employer in the United States. It hit almost 14 million workers prior to the pandemic. In fact, maybe while I'm talking, it would be awesome if, I'm sure many of you worked in the restaurant industry at some point in your youth. It'd be awesome if you would introduce yourselves over chat and just say if you did work in the industry, what position you held. That would be amazing, because I'm sure 1 in 2 Americans have worked in the restaurant industry at some point in their lifetime. It's a kind of universal experience. But despite the industry's size and its growth and the fact that so many people have worked in it, it has been and had been prior to the pandemic the nation's absolute lowest paying employer. And all of our research showed that that was largely due to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We called it the other NRA. It represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's, the Olive Gardens. And in doing research about the history of the National Restaurant Association, we found that, in fact, it has been around not 50 or 60 or 70 years, as I originally thought, but 150 years since emancipation of slavery. Because it turns out that tipping does not originate in the United States. It originated in feudal Europe. It was something that aristocrats and nobles gave to serfs and vassals, but always on top of a wage. It was an extra or bonus given by these nobles and aristocrats to, honestly, their inferiors. But it was always on top of a wage. And when that idea came to the States in the 1850s, it was right before emancipation, and Americans resoundingly rejected tipping. They thought it was undemocratic. They thought it was a vestige of feudalism. And in fact, at the time, Alexis de Tocqueville came to the U.S. and wrote about how great is American democracy and said, it's so great. One of the reasons it's so great is that there is no tipping in the U.S. But that populist movement that opposed tipping and in fact passed bans on tipping in 6 states was ultimately squashed by the restaurant industry, even though it spread to Europe. And the labor movement picked it up in Europe and actually got rid of tipping in much of Europe with the rallying cry that we are professionals. We don't live off the mercy of this feudal system. We deserve a living wage. But instead, in the US, we went in the opposite direction because of slavery. At emancipation, the restaurant lobby wanted the right to hire newly freed slaves, mostly Black women, actually, pay them nothing and have them live entirely on tips. And there's a part of this history that's become more evident in more recent years, which is in 1850, when waiters were actually mostly men, and they worked in large cities like New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. They went on strike. These men went on strike, and they went on strike for higher wages. They were being paid a wage, and they went on strike for higher wages. And restaurants largely replaced them with women. So by the time we got to emancipation in 1865, the industry had become largely female. There was a majority female workforce. And then with emancipation, there was the entrance of Black workers, Black women in particular, into the industry. And we saw both the feminization of the industry and the entrance of Black workers result in a $0 wage. The restaurant lobby wanted the right to hire Black women, pay them nothing, have them live entirely on tips, and have tips be their only source of income. There was another industry that tried to do this at emancipation. It was the Pullman train cars. Some of you may know this history, that the Pullman company was a luxury train liner. This is how rich people got across from the East Coast to the West Coast. They hired tens of thousands of Black men, called them all George, made them work as porters, only for tips on the trains. And A. Philip Randolph organized the first Black union in the United States, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and won the right to an actual wage rather than living exclusively on tips. But the women were not so lucky. There was no union for them, the Black women, and so they were given a $0 wage as long as tips brought them to the full minimum wage. And that became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the minimum wage for the first time, except for 3 groups of Black workers: farm workers at the time, domestic workers at the time, and tipped restaurant workers who were told you get a $0 wage as long as tips bring you to the full minimum wage. And we went from 0 in 1938 all the way up to the whopping and incredible $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in the United States of America. In fact, 43 states in the United States, not California, though we are at risk, as long as this exists in other states, we are at risk of it becoming like this in California. California is one of 7 states that moved away from this system. But 43 states agreed to, or have persisted with, this legacy of slavery with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And 40 out of 50 states have wages of $5 or less in 2020. Today, it's a 70% female workforce of tipped workers, mostly waitresses in casual restaurants, IHOP, Denny's, mom and pop diners across America, struggling to make ends meet and feed their children in tips. And in fact, they experience 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. They use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. And they have literally and statistically the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry in the United States of America. Actually, we're working with Professor Catherine McKinnon, who many of you know coined the term sexual harassment, very famous legal scholar. And just over the last couple of days, we've been looking at some data we've been gathering on this issue, and says there just is no other sector or industry that has a higher rate of sexual harassment than the restaurant industry because of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, because these women are forced to live off of tips and tolerate all kinds of inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families in tips. In fact, we did research surveying thousands of workers across America together with Forward Together and found that, in fact, women were twice as likely to experience sexual harassment in states with a sub-minimum wage of $2.13 an hour as they were in California and states with a full minimum wage with tips on top. Why? Because a woman in California, even though half the level of sexual harassment in California in our industry is still extremely high and much higher than most other industries. I'm not pretending as if there isn't sexual harassment in California, but it has been cut in half because women can count on an actual wage from their boss. Like every other worker in every other industry, they're not as dependent on the tips to feed their families. We did an event with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2019. As you all know, she was a bartender prior to becoming a Congress member. We did a server for an hour event. We do these with many different Congress members. And she said at that event, so she acted as a server and then, heard from workers and then spoke and said, I remember that as a server or bartender, maybe at the first of the month, if a guy tries to grab you, you can swat away that hand. But by the 15th of the month and beyond, you are going to put up with whatever that guy does to you because he's paying your rent. You don't pay your rent through your wages. You pay your rent through tips. And for women who are single mothers, and a disproportionate amount of tipped workers are women who are single mothers, they rely on these tips and have to put up with anything that comes their way to feed their children. All of this was before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, this enormous industry, I'm not talking about a sliver of the economy, I'm talking about the nation's largest workforce of low-wage women. Before the pandemic, this enormous workforce of women struggled mightily. Many lived in cars. Many moved from place to place because they couldn't afford a place to live. Many could not eat and waited till they got to the restaurant for what they call family meal, which they were fed by the restaurant before their shift. The level of inequality and suffering faced by women in this industry was tremendous prior to the pandemic. It was a pre-existing condition of the United States prior to the pandemic. And it's so important to recognize I'm not talking about a tiny sliver of women. I'm talking about a huge, huge sector, 14 million workers, almost 1 in 10 working Americans worked in this industry prior to the pandemic. So we had been fighting many years prior to the pandemic to end this sub-minimum wage across America, to have all states and Congress follow the path that California set in providing a full minimum wage with tips on top. And we won the issue on the ballot in Maine. We won the issue on the ballot in Michigan and in Washington, D.C. Because honestly, as you might all know from looking at what just happened November 2020 in Florida, raising the minimum wage, and in particular eliminating the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, is an overwhelmingly popular issue, popular among both Republican and Democratic voters alike. If we want to know an issue that might bring a very divided nation together, this is clearly it. Nearly 65% of Floridians voted to raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour and almost eliminate their sub-minimum wage, raise it to almost $13 an hour. That was 12 percentage points more than the folks that voted for Trump. This is a universally popular issue. So anytime it goes to the ballot, and you ask people, should tipped workers get the full minimum wage? People say, I thought they already were making the minimum wage. I did not know as a consumer that every time I tip in a restaurant, it's not actually on top of the wage. It actually cuts into the worker's wage, because the way it works in 43 states until hopefully a few months from now, the way it works in 43 states is that every time you tip, that is legally that provides the legal ability for an employer to pay the worker less than the minimum wage. So your tip is not an extra or a bonus, it is the wage itself, and it allows the employer to pay less. So every time we took this to the ballot or to the people, it won overwhelmingly. But every single time we took it to the ballot, the National Restaurant Association, with all its money and power and influence, was able to convince legislators, often Democrats in these states, to overturn the will of the people, making this issue not just an issue of economic and gender and racial injustice, but an issue of democracy, because it demonstrates the outsized influence of this incredible trade lobby that most people don't even know exists. So we had been winning and experiencing reverses until July 2019, when we won our biggest victory yet, which was that we won this issue in the U.S. House of Representatives. In July 2019, the U.S. House of Representatives voted not only to raise the wage to $15 an hour, but to fully eliminate the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. It was the first time since emancipation that either House of Congress moved to eliminate this wage, this two-tiered wage system. And yet, when it happened, it was a bittersweet victory for multiple reasons. For one, we knew Mitch McConnell, who led the Senate at the time, would never move this issue, and in fact, he did not. It has not moved until now. Two, though, we realized after years of saying we as women tipped workers should not be left out of the minimum wage, include us. And then the minimum wage passed and included us, at least in the House. And we saw that some others were left out. So the Raise the Wage Act that passed in July 2019 was 15 and included tipped workers and workers with disabilities, who, by the way, don't get a full minimum wage in California, and youth. But it left out incarcerated workers, who get a sub-minimum wage because of the exception to the 13th Amendment that allows for slavery in the case of incarceration. It left out gig workers. It left out farm workers. And so we said, there is no way that we with integrity can stop. There's no way that we with integrity can fight now only for tipped workers to get a full minimum wage. We now have to fight to end all sub-minimum wages in the United States of America. After all, wasn't the idea of a minimum wage that is the least that you can earn? That is the idea of a minimum wage. When you've got more than a tenth of the economy able to be paid less legally, there is something wrong. And that something wrong goes to the heart of, I think, what everybody needs to be concerned about in America, which is the way in which our economy values people less. It is racialized and gendered capitalism. It is the way in which people are literally, legally valued less. Tipped workers are overwhelmingly women, and they get a $2 wage. Incarcerated people are disproportionately Black and brown, and they get a sub-minimum wage. Gig workers are immigrants and often people of color. They get a sub-minimum wage, particularly after Prop 22 here in California. Workers with disabilities clearly have disabilities. They are valued less, literally, for their disability. So the very idea of a sub-minimum wage in the United States is truly the epitome of everything we should be fighting against, which is not just income inequality, but the way in which income inequality intersects with race and gender and ableism and everything else that is wrong with our economy and our country, and that we need to fix going forward. So in February 2020, just a month before the pandemic shut everything down, we convened the first gathering in U.S. history of all sub-minimum wage workers, tipped workers, nail salon, car wash, restaurant, parking attendants, airport wheelchair attendants. In most states, do you know that if you are in a wheelchair, the person pushing your wheelchair earns $2.13 an hour? Incarcerated workers, workers with disabilities, gig workers, all came together and voted to come together under one umbrella, fighting for one fair wage, a full minimum wage for everybody in America, what we call no worker left behind, that nobody who works in the United States of America should get less than a full minimum wage. We should be particularly embarrassed in California. Yes, we have a full minimum wage for tipped workers, but we do not have a full minimum wage for workers with disabilities or incarcerated workers, and we need to be very ashamed. We are leading the country in wildfires. And a third of our firefighting workforce last year was incarcerated, earning 11 cents an hour. When the insurrection happened on January 6th in the nation's capital, furniture was destroyed. That furniture was built by federal prisoners who earn less than 50 cents an hour and will be paid less than 50 cents an hour to fix that furniture that needs to go back in the Capitol building. We should be ashamed as a state, as a country, that anybody is paid less than the minimum wage, particularly when it is a valuation of women and people of color, workers with disabilities, anybody who is valued less in our society. So that conference was amazing, but a month later, the pandemic, of course, shut everything down. And the restaurant industry, as I'm sure you all have seen, was particularly decimated. Thousands of restaurants across America shut down. 6 million workers lost their jobs in the restaurant industry. And 60% of restaurant workers across America, 60, particularly tipped workers, were unable to access unemployment insurance or had very difficult time accessing unemployment insurance, in most cases in the rest of the country, because they earned a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. In states that paid $2 and $3 and $4 an hour, a mostly female workforce of women was told your wage is too low to qualify for benefits. And that was even worse for women of color who tended to work in more casual restaurants earning cash tips that were largely unreported, not just by them, but by their employers. I remember speaking to a Michigan worker named Sarah. She's part of our organization. She said, I have been religiously reporting my tips. She worked in a small bar in a small town in Michigan, earned cash tips. I religiously report my tips, she said. My employer never did. So when I went to apply for unemployment insurance, the state of Michigan told me that my wage of $3.67 an hour, which is the wage in Michigan, by the way, we had organized 400,000 people to raise that wage. We won. And then the legislature turned that wage back, and a year later told the women whose wages they turned back from 12 to 3 that their wage was too low to qualify for benefits. So millions of workers like Sarah, mothers, single mothers, were iced out. No benefits whatsoever. In Sarah's case, even the federal pandemic unemployment assistance, which she was told she was qualified for, eligible for, because the federal was not based on her income. It was just based on unemployment. But she couldn't access it because all unemployment insurance runs through the state systems, and Michigan had already marked her as a denial. So she actually could not receive the unemployment insurance that she was eligible for. And that happened to millions and millions of workers across America. They were told they earned too little to qualify for benefits. In the face of that, we launched a relief fund for service workers, tipped workers, sub-minimum wage workers across America. Unexpectedly raised a lot of money. 228,000 workers applied for relief in 50 states. And we immediately started organizing them into online events like this one, town hall meetings with Senator Harris and Senator Booker and Senator Gillibrand and Governor Whitmer and many others. And in these digital town hall meetings, I heard something that I had not heard from workers in 20 years of organizing restaurant and other service workers. Workers were saying we shouldn't go back to work without one fair wage. We should not go back to work without a full minimum wage with tips on top. It is not worth it. So we started to organize these workers. We held strikes in multiple cities over the summer. We held actions. We held digital events. We were out in the streets. And surprisingly, as a result, hundreds of restaurant owners changed their mind on this issue. We heard from literally hundreds and hundreds of restaurant owners, not chains, but independent restaurant owners who came to us and said, maybe it's time to change this system, including folks that had funded the National Restaurant Association to fight us. People changed their mind and told us that they wanted to work with us to actually move the country and their industry to a full minimum wage. In some cases, they were moved by seeing their workers not receive unemployment insurance because of their $2 and $3 wages. In some cases, they were moved by the murder of George Floyd to want to move away from a legacy of slavery. But in most cases, they couldn't get their workers to come back to work without a full minimum wage. We did surveys in the fall of 2020 to really understand what workers were going through as they did go back to work. and why so many workers were saying, we're not going to do it. Even if we have no way to feed our children, we're not going to do it. So we surveyed about 2,000 workers in 6 states all across the country. And what we found was pretty horrific. About a half of workers who had gone back to work said that at least one person in the restaurant had contracted COVID. Not surprising after you know that in September, the CDC named the restaurant industry one of the most key super spreader locations. They said that adults are twice as likely to get COVID eating in a restaurant. Imagine working in a restaurant. So at least half of workers said at least one person got COVID. A third of workers said somebody had died. 70% of workers said their employers were not following safety protocols. 90% of workers said their tips were down 50 to 75%, partly because sales were down, partly because the clientele changed. Regulars who ate out and perhaps tipped more, were less aggressive, were worried about COVID. We're not eating out. The people eating out during the pandemic have been a slightly different clientele, people who are not as worried about COVID and don't want to be told by these workers to wear masks and socially distance. And in fact, more than 60% of workers said they cannot enforce social distancing and mask rules on the very same customers from whom they have to get tips to make up their base wage, because there's so much aggression and hostility from people when they're told to do those things that they earn less money in tips if they tell them, please wear a mask when you go to the bathroom, please sit 6 feet apart. But worst of all, most horrifically, and this is what everybody in the Women's March needs to know, has become a sadly universal phenomenon during the pandemic. Worst of all, 40% of workers said that sexual harassment went way up during the pandemic. And hundreds of women submitted comments to us, basically repeating verbatim what male customers had said to them, which was, take your mask off so I can see how cute you are to determine how much to tip you. Take your mask off so I can see the pretty face before I think about how much I want to tip. Take your mask off so I can stick my tongue down your throat. Take your mask off, let me see the pretty girl who served me. These are not comments I've made up. Our report, which I'm happy to share with anybody here, had 6 pages of hundreds and hundreds of comments from women servers around the country being told by male customers to essentially kill themselves, to be judged, for a chance, not for a guarantee, but for a chance to earn a tip. And this fact obliterated the idea that tipping in this country is correlated with service. There's a professor at Cornell who spent his life studying tipping, and long before the pandemic, there was mountains of evidence that showed that tipping is not correlated with service in this country. Tipping is correlated with the race and gender of the server. If she's a woman, she gets tipped more if she touches the customer or allows herself to be touched. For women, it is also correlated with breast size. It is correlated with her hair color, her eye color. It is not based on the quality of her service, which it should be, but tipping reflects the incredible biases that I spoke about before. It reflects not just the biases, but the power dynamic between male customers and a woman server who feels tipping is down 50 to 75%. Every customer that walks in the door, I rely so much on their tips. So if they tell me to take off my mask to judge my looks, I have no choice if I want to feed my kids except to take off my mask, which made this group of workers the only essential workers to not receive a minimum wage. And I say essential because if this is the most dangerous super spreader location, according to the CDC, we rely on these workers to enforce social distancing and mask rules, which they are unable to do. So they are essential. They're doing more for less. They're being now asked to be public health marshals for far less in tips, 75% less in tips. And on top of that, they have become the only essential workers to be asked to remove their protective gear to earn their income, for a chance to earn their income. That is a COVID crisis. I spoke to an editor of a major national newspaper a few days ago, and she said, why is this $15 bill included in this COVID bill? It doesn't make any sense. It should be a separate bill. There's no reason why $15 needs to be part of a COVID relief package. And I said to her, this is a COVID emergency. We as a women across America should be screaming with our heads on fire that there are millions of women being asked to go back to work. Their only chance at income is if they take off their masks and expose themselves to, frankly, inebriated and aggressive and hostile customers. It is a COVID crisis, and it has to end as a COVID emergency. The sub-minimum wage for tipped workers was an issue of racial injustice, a literal legacy of slavery, an economic injustice, a gender injustice, and now it has become a matter of life and death. Literally, a matter of life and death. It is a life-threatening situation to have millions of workers going back to work, still relying on tips to feed their kids, from a clientele base that is requiring them to take off their masks to get those tips. So thankfully, with all of the ways in which we tried to uplift this emergency, the Biden-Harris campaign did end up naming this issue to their platform in their jobs agenda, their women's agenda, and their racial equity agenda. We were not, during the 2020 campaign, we didn't endorse a presidential candidate. We were not fighting for a particular candidate, but we were fighting for an end to the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And it was very heartening for millions of workers across America to know that the folks that finally won the Democratic ticket heard us, heard our plea, saw the strikes, understood that this is a COVID emergency, and named it to their platform. And in fact, in Georgia and Michigan and Pennsylvania, we mobilized 50,000 low-wage workers, service voters, restaurant workers, tipped workers, mostly single women, single moms, who had never voted ever before to vote in this election on this issue. This is the issue that drove them to vote. No candidate, no party drove them to vote. It was the idea that their wage in Georgia is $2.13 an hour and could be $15. It was the idea that it's $3.67 in Michigan and $2.83 in Pennsylvania, and there was a chance that it could go up. That is what motivated them to vote. And so we, like many others, said, well, then you better deliver. You better deliver now for these workers who turned out for the first time. And thankfully and amazingly and surprisingly, we have seen the first instance of a response, which is that last Thursday, when Biden announced his $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that includes vaccines and unemployment insurance, $1,200 stimulus checks, childcare subsidies, hundreds of billions of dollars for small business recovery, that it also includes a $15 minimum wage and full elimination of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and full elimination of the sub-minimum wage for workers with disabilities and youth. It's not everybody, but wow. In a matter of weeks, we could see an ending of a legacy of slavery, an ending of a source of suffering for literally tens of millions of women over the last 150 years since emancipation. And that is why I am so emotional, because we desperately need your help. In a matter of weeks, Democrats, who now control the Senate, will decide whether they vote for that bill in its entirety or whether they will carve it up, negotiate, water it down. And actually on Tuesday, just 3 days from now, this bill, the Raise the Wage Act, will be introduced in Congress. And immediately the House will start to look at it. Blue Dog Democrats will start to talk about maybe we should leave out restaurants. They're struggling right now. And then it will go to the Senate. And in particular, we are concerned that several moderate Democrats from Arizona, Colorado, West Virginia, New Hampshire, Maine might actually say, let's raise the wage to 15, but because restaurants are struggling, let's leave the tipped workers behind at 50 or 60% of the wage. We've had a two-tiered wage system in the restaurant industry for 150 years. It is a not just a legacy of slavery, it is a legalized form of gender pay inequity. Restaurants are legally able to pay women a third of what they pay men. And now the idea of moderate Democrats might be, oh, let's raise it to 50%. From a third, let's raise it to 50%. Enough is enough in terms of valuing women or anybody less than a full livable minimum wage. We need your help to actually tell Congress, tell Democrats in particular, stop rolling over to the National Restaurant Association. Deliver for the workers who gave you control of the White House, the Senate, and the House. Deliver for them by providing now and forever a full livable minimum wage with tips on top. It is a COVID emergency. It is the only way this economy and this country can recover, because there will be no way for our economy to recover if low-wage workers have no ability to consume, no ability to feed their children. There will be no way without fundamentally changing the way we eat, the way we eat out, the way we consume, the way we pay people, and whether or not we end these lifelong legacies of slavery. I have a link that I can provide that we're asking people to fill out, to send a letter to your Congress member asking them to take action now, endorse the Raise the Wage Act as is without any carve-outs or lesser wages for anybody. But we also really could use your help if people are interested in working with us over the next 6 weeks to get this done. We are so close. For me, it's the apex of 20 years of organizing, but honestly, who cares about me? It is in the name of 150 years of women who've been struggling with us. Help us get this across the finish line with women at 100% of the wage, no less. I want to stop and open it up for questions and discussion.
Hi, Jaro. This is Christina. We do have one question, and that is from Jessica. Will the guidelines of the PPP be able to help small business owners pay the $15 wage so they will have no argument?
So it's not just PPP, which honestly was a mess, as many of you know. It's the fact that the COVID stimulus plan that Biden has introduced includes hundreds of billions of dollars of small business relief. This is direct cash assistance for businesses across America. That is not likely to be touched. That is in there. It is going to pass overwhelmingly. Even Republicans will vote for that. It is the wage that is the problem. And what is frustrating about that is that during the pandemic, there has been such a desire by both Democrats and Republicans to worry about small business. Let's protect small business. Let's protect employers without really any concern for workers. And the problem with that is even if you provide direct cash assistance to employers, which is important, they won't be able to sustain unless there is a base of consumers, which is Main Street for most small businesses. A one-time cash infusion is not going to allow a business or a restaurant to live on forever. What does allow a restaurant to live on forever is the ability of people to eat out, is the ability of people to consume. And so we need business relief together with worker relief. Otherwise, it won't work. But the answer is yes. There is no question there will be hundreds of billions of dollars of small business relief. It is the worker that is more the question, worker relief.
Thank you. There's one other question from Linda, and that was how to help, what help is needed. So I think the question is in addition to what you've already mentioned, if you could give some pointers.
Yeah, so we'd love to be in touch with anybody who's willing to help, but we are right now. So I told you that we created a relief fund, and 228,000 workers applied in all 50 states. And so we are right now calling through workers in that relief fund, getting them cash relief, and also talking to them about calling their senators to end this sub-minimum wage and get paid $15 an hour. So especially we're organizing these workers in those states that I mentioned where there are concerns about Democratic senators who might not stick with a full minimum wage for tipped workers. So that's Arizona, Colorado, New Hampshire, West Virginia, Maine. These states, we are calling through our list of applicants and encouraging workers to talk to their senators. So anybody who's willing to help us, volunteer, make calls to these workers, help get them cash relief, and also get them to call their senators would be most welcome. And I teach at UC Berkeley, and we had 150 students making calls to this list over the summer. And during the pandemic, when so many of us felt so helpless, it's been such a beautiful moment talking to workers in all these states across America who are really, really struggling, making sure they get some relief, and then talking to them about the fact that immediate relief isn't going to actually save us, neither for the business nor for the worker. We have to fundamentally change this pre-existing condition that existed in America, which is these absurdly low wages that don't allow people to survive. So if you're interested in calling people, we can train you to do that. But the other piece is small business. We have 800 restaurant owners across America who I mentioned to you are working with us because they've changed their mind on this issue. They actually believe in a full minimum wage with tips on top. They believe that's actually the only way to move forward, the only sustainable path for the industry. There are many other small businesses in these states who also should join us in calling for a full minimum wage, because what's most likely to happen without our organizing and advocacy is that maybe a $15 minimum wage would pass, but the Restaurant Association is going to lobby for a lesser wage for tipped workers, which means that the tiny florist in Phoenix will pay $15, but the IHOP and the Denny's will be able to pay much less. And so we need help reaching small businesses in all of these states, and frankly, every state, to tell their senators, it's not fair. If I'm going to pay 15, everybody should pay 15, including these multi-billion-dollar restaurant corporations. Let's have a level playing field. So we need help. We need help calling workers. We need help getting in touch with small businesses, whether they're restaurants or not, to call and email and send letters to their senators saying the time is up. We need a full minimum wage for everybody.
Thank you. We do have. Oops, sorry.
People can, if people are interested in being a part of that, I can provide my email at both the link. Do I put it here in this comment section? Yes. I'm going to put both the link to send a letter to your Congress member and my email address so that you can be in touch if you'd like to volunteer. This link, this website, Fight Don't Starve, that actually comes from the Depression. It's the rallying cry of unemployed workers during the Depression, Fight Don't Starve. And so we resurrected it. I did want to quickly share, for those of you that are artists or love to see the way in which art is used in social justice, we actually created a huge, iconic image, a 24-foot art piece in multiple cities. Let's see. We call her Elena the Essential Worker. I don't know if you can see this. We built her a 24-foot Elena the Essential Service Worker in multiple cities. This is her in Midtown Manhattan, New York. This is her in Chicago. This is her in Philadelphia and in Times Square, in Washington, D.C., at the Women's March. This is her towering over George Washington in New York City and Wall Street, Women's March. And she has been our icon. She exists in 6 cities. This is the Women's March in D.C., and you can see her in the back there. We've created her as the symbol, the new Rosie the Riveter, Elena the Essential Worker, who demands to be paid, not just clapped for. We don't need to just clap for essential workers. We need to actually pay them a full wage and make sure that they don't have to remove their protective gear to do their jobs and get income.
This is Christina again. We do have a couple of other questions. The first one is from Daisy. What is a quick response that you can give folks who immediately say that they're against raising the minimum wage because it will increase the cost of living and hurt small business owners?
So one quick response is that if you look at chains, Olive Garden, Applebee's, IHOP, in California, we have a higher minimum wage than almost every other state. So we're going up to 15 over the next couple of years. Those chains, Applebee's, IHOP, Olive Garden, if you look at their menu prices in anywhere in California, whether it's San Francisco or Fresno, they are exactly the same prices at the Applebee's as they are in Georgia, where the wage is $2.13 an hour, or West Virginia, where the wage is $2.13 an hour, or anywhere else in the country. Those chains are growing faster in California. And how is it that they manage to keep their prices pretty much the same everywhere? It's because there's so much more consumption power in California because people are paid a wage that they're able to consume. We have poverty in California for sure, but it's incomparable to the poverty among working people in other states that get paid $2 an hour and are unable to eat out or support their own small business restaurants. Our small business growth is higher. The small business growth rates in the restaurant industry are higher in California than they are in other states, undeniably. Every sector of our industry is growing faster in California than it has in other states. So I think if you just, I can provide all kinds of data and white papers from various economists showing you that actually prices do not rise significantly. In fact, I did a paper with a bunch of other professors called A Dime a Day, where we actually looked at if you raised everybody in the entire food system, from farm workers to restaurant workers across the country, to a $15 minimum wage, the total increase for all food bought outside the home, that's groceries and restaurants combined, for anybody is about 40 cents. 40 cents. And that's including any increased price from the farms to the restaurants. So it's not a significant increase. Why? Because we forget that when we raise the minimum wage, we increase consumption. We increase the ability of Main Street to support small business. We increase the ability of people to consume. So yes, there might be a low to moderate price increase, but there will be a much better ability for Americans to actually consume, period. And then with small business growth, it's just undeniable. I mean, the 7 states that have a $15 minimum wage or have gotten rid of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers have higher rates of small business growth than the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage of as low as $2. Because again, restaurant workers are not able to support small business in those states on those wages.
Thank you. We have another question. This one comes from Middle Way. Can you share why you are supporting continued tipping on top of minimum wage? I had assumed abolishing tipping was best.
So I mean, I think most people know, as much as we're fighting for a $15 minimum wage, I think most people know that it's nearly impossible to live on $15 an hour anywhere in the country. Tips are required still on top of a $15 minimum wage because people have a hard time living on $15, and workers should get more than that. They should have they should be valued honestly as the professionals that they are, the skilled professionals that they are. I think there's so much denigration of this work. You know, in Europe, you go to school for many years to be a hospitality professional. They're skilled professional professions, occupations. And it's only the fact that these workers are paid as little as they are that we don't value this as a profession. And you all know this generally. Majority female sectors are not valued in the same way. They're not valued income-wise because they're not valued as high-status professions, nurses compared to doctors, teachers compared to professors, right? That's the same is true in the restaurant industry. It is a majority female workforce. And so the truth is that we need people to not just be paid $15 an hour. Ultimately, we need them to be valued for the professionals that they are. And as long as we're not talking of a minimum wage that's much higher, tips are still needed on top of that wage to get people closer to an income they can live on, and not just to survive, but closer to what they should be paid as professionals. It is true that many restaurants, once you go to a full minimum wage with tips on top, then decide, you know what, I want to move away from this system altogether. And they move to a system of service charges, or some people call hospitality included, that all costs are included in the price of the meal. And we're supportive of that move. But as legislation, the first step is getting people to a full minimum wage with tips on top. And once we do that, once we get from a $2 wage to a full minimum wage, then we can look at ways to support restaurants that want to go beyond that.
Thank you. As of right now, I don't see any other questions. So if anyone does have any other questions, please feel free to add them into the comment section. As of right now, no more questions.
All right. I do notice one comment that I wanted to address. Thank you to Wendy, I think, for sharing your experience working as so many different positions in the restaurant industry. When we first put out research in 2014 showing that incredibly high levels of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry, a woman wrote an op-ed in the New York Times responding to our research, saying that she was a feminist studies professor at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. But until she saw our research, she was a professor at UNLV teaching feminist theory and moonlighting as a server because she wasn't paid enough as an instructor at UNLV. So she was working as a server as well. And she said until she saw our research, she herself didn't recognize what she was experiencing in the restaurant industry as sexual harassment, because it has been so normalized for tipped workers that you not just tolerate whatever comes your way. You don't just put up with it. You actually encourage it. You're told, I can't tell you the number of women I've talked to who've said, my boss sent me home to come back and dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips. They sent me home to come back and show more. Another young woman told me that she was repeatedly grabbed on the butt, and when she complained, the manager said, you're so lucky to get it while you're young. There's a sense that if you're harassed, that's a good thing in our industry. You want to be harassed because that's an indication that you're going to make more money in tips. And it's the source, by the way, of harassment from coworkers and management. Because if all of the men who work in the kitchen and are your managers know that you are fully dependent on tips, which are variable and depend on the whims and biases of the customers, then they have power over you. I spoke with many women who in the industry who told me, I have to flash. I have to flash every day to the cooks in order to get them to make the meal just as I need it to please the customer and get the tips. Or if I don't comply with my managers wanting to kiss me or touch me, I then get lesser tables, lesser shifts, morning section as opposed to evening section, making a lot less money on tips. So the fact that these women rely on the biases and whims and variability of tips gives every man, customers, coworkers, and managers power over her. And when that is the first job for 1 in 2 American women, maybe many of you, our daughters, my 2 daughters, will likely work in the restaurant industry at some point, high school, college, graduate school, and I am good with that. I have a lot of pride. This is a dignified profession as long as by the time that they do that, they are not paid $2 and they're not expected and told by their managers not just to tolerate harassment, but to go out and get it. Let us end this now for the women who work in the industry, have worked in the industry, for ourselves and for our daughters. We have a chance to end this in just 6 or 7 weeks. Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Saru, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for coming and learning more. We are going to be gathering again in the room for closing sessions, where we'll be sharing some calls for actions, one of them being a link to more on One Fair Wage. So please join us there, and let's keep this going. And everyone, just please give a thank you to Saru. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Really appreciate you all.